Ruling over his country between 1611 and 1632, Gustavus Adolphus is credited as having brought Sweden from insignificance to the status of a great European power. History remembers him as one of the greatest military commanders of the last 500 years. Gustavus Adolphus was born on December 9, 1594, to Duke Charles of the ruling Vasa Dynasty in Sweden. At the time of Gustavus's birth, his cousin Sigismund was king of Sweden, but was ruling it from Poland. During the child's formative years, a struggle unfolded between his father, who was Protestant, and his Catholic cousin for rulership. In 1599, Charles managed to wrestle the kingship away from Sigismund. He ruled as regent for the next 5 years, before taking the title of King Charles IX in 1605. Young Charles was groomed to be a military leader from an early age. By the age of 14, he was gifted the Duchy of Gagnef-Floda in Dalecarlia. 2 years later, he was riding at the head of the Swedish Armed Forces in East Gotland as they fended off Danish invasion. When his father died in 1611, the Swedish Parliament was so impressed with the fighting ability and overall maturity of the young man that they waived the age restriction and allowed him to rule unfettered from the age of 17. The teenager inherited a kingdom that would have challenged even the most experienced of rulers. War was threatening not only with Denmark, but also with Russia and Poland. At the same time, Sigismund saw the death of Charles as his opportunity to reclaim the throne and made efforts to do so by forcing Gustavus to renounce the title. The most immediate concern, however, was to face up to the threats from the Danish. Leaving domestic affairs in the hands of his trusted chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, Gustavus led his army into Denmark as that country's army was invading his. This bold and daring move was to characterize the original and brilliant military strategies that were to make Gustavus one of the greatest military leaders the world has ever seen. The invasion of Denmark was not a military success, but it did manage to bring about peace with Sweden's most threatening neighbor. This allowed Gustavus to focus on the next threat, Russia. Between 1613 and 1617, he led his army on a victorious campaign that not only ended the threat of Russian invasion, but increased Sweden's territory and cut off access to the Baltic Sea from Moscow. At the age of 23, Gustavus embarked upon his third major military campaign as king. This time, the target was Poland. Gustavus led his army up the eastern coast of the Baltic, taking possession of such strategically important Polish ports as Livonia. A truce was agreed upon for 2 years, after which he invaded the southern coast of the Baltic. The thoroughly defeated and demoralized Poles agreed to a 6-year truce in 1629. By now, the military exploits of the young warrior king were internationally renowned, and he had gained the title of Lion of the North. The ending of the war with Poland freed up the Swedish army to intervene in the 30 Years' War in Germany. From 1627 onward, Gustavus had contributed small numbers of men to support the Danish war against Germany, but now the Swedish king was determined to do more in order to ensure the safety of his kingdom and the Baltic, and to liberate the oppressed lands in Germany. In early 1630, Gustavus convened a council of his ministers and laid before them his case for invading Germany. He told them that he was convinced that once Emperor Ferdinand had quashed all Protestant resistance in his own land, he would attack Sweden. He also reminded his ministers that the Habsburg Empire had actively supported Poland in its fight against Sweden. This, despite the fact that Germany and Sweden were officially at peace with each other, and just a few months ago, during the peace negotiations at Lübeck, Bohemian statesman Albrecht Wallenstein had rudely dismissed the Swedish envoys out of hand. When these men refused to leave, they had been threatened with violence. This had greatly angered the king. In the final part of his appeal to his ministers, Gustavus spoke of the oppression that the Protestants were facing at the hand of the Catholics in Germany. Gustavus was certainly no fan of Emperor Ferdinand II. He believed that Ferdinand had personally insulted the Swedish flag and went out of his way to disrupt peace negotiations between Poland and Sweden. On top of everything else, Gustavus Adolphus loved war. In fact, if any man was born for war, then he was that man. From 1629, Swedish military preparations had been underway for an invasion of Germany. Large quantities of nitrate and sulfur were gathered, and factories were at full production, turning out swords, armor, and other weaponry. A war tax was also put in place, with emphasis on the nobility. For the first year of the campaign, 3/4 of the total tax revenue of Sweden was directed toward the war effort. All males between the ages of 16 and 60 were also ordered to sign up for military service. This included nobles who were to serve in the cavalry. The army also brought in troops from abroad, with 2 regiments of Scots soldiers being transferred across from the Danish army. Mercenaries from other parts of Europe and from England also made their way to Sweden. The total force gathered was around 76,000 men. The Swedish invasion of Germany began on July 6, 1630. It was led personally by Gustavus Adolphus himself and consisted of around 13,000 troops. His army arrived at Peenemünde on the island of Usedom. Gustavus was the first one to disembark. However, he slipped and fell on the shore. Recovering quickly, he knelt down and offered up prayers for the successful landing. He then stood and took hold of a spade that was handed to him, digging it into the sand. This was the signal to his men that they were to busy themselves with the work of digging entrenchments to cover the landing. It took 2 full days for the Swedish army to disembark. By the time that all of the men were landed, however, Gustavus became aware that there was a severe shortage of food available for them. This infuriated the king, who severely criticized Johann Skye, the man in charge of ensuring the food supply. He then issued that food stores be obtained from Stralsund and that supplies from Prussia be fast-tracked. On the 3rd day after his arrival on the island, the king took 1,200 musketeers and a force of cavalry and moved to a position opposite Wolgast. He then took his time to reconnoiter that town. The imperialists had built a fortress to defend the town. After assessing its strengths and weaknesses, Gustavus sent back the order for 1,000 musketeers to be sent up. He then ordered his men forward to take the fortress. Upon arrival, however, it was discovered that the fortress had been abandoned and that the imperialist troops had moved back to Wolgast itself. Gustavus left 1,000 men at the fortress and then set out with 3,500 foot soldiers and 2,500 cavalry in order to clear all imperial resistance out of Usedom. As the Swedish forces systematically made their way up the island, imperial troops retreated across the water to a number of bases that had been established opposite the island. Gustavus had his men garrison each of these bases as he continued to sweep Usedom clear of imperial troops. The German forces offered no resistance as they retreated across the Volyn Bridge. The port of Stettin was reclaimed with the imperial forces being pushed back from the coast. Gustavus quickly assumed overall command of the Allied forces, leading them to one victory after another over the Germans. In September 1631, he won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld. At the Battle of Rhein in April 1631, he scored another huge victory, one which left his adversary, Johann Serkleim, the Count of Tilly, mortally wounded on the field of battle. When he learned after the battle that the opposing general was near death, Gustavus sent his personal physician to attend to Tilly. Before dying, the Count told the doctor, "Your king is truly a noble knight." Tilly was replaced as head of the Catholic forces by Albrecht von Waldenstein. He won a victory against Gustavus with an assault on his fortified positions at Alte Vest on September 3, 1632. The following month, despite having suffered serious losses, Gustavus attacked Waldenstein's entrenched position at Lutzen, near Leipzig. The morning of the battle, November 16, 1632, brought with it a dense fog. Nothing could happen until it was lifted, which didn't take place until noon. At about 11:45 a.m., the Swedish king knelt before his men and offered up a prayer for victory. This aroused his men, who similarly fell to their knees and began to offer up a hymnal. Gustavus then mounted his horse and began to ride up and down the line, to encourage and motivate his men. When the fog cleared, Gustavus and his men saw that the town of Lutzen was in flames. Wallenstein had ordered his men to put it to the torch earlier that morning in order to prevent Gustavus from using the town as a cover from which to outflank him. The Swedish king now gave the order to advance. The charge was sounded and the cavalry rushed forward as the infantry made their way toward the high road and the entrenched positions of the imperial musketeers. The Swedish advance was immediately greeted by a hail of musket fire and artillery from the windmills on the hill. However, Gustavus's men pushed on, but at the loss of many lives. They managed to overwhelm the imperial musketeers in the trenches, who abandoned their positions and rushed back to the main force. The attackers were now able to move into and beyond the trenches. The 7 cannon there were taken possession of and turned against the Imperials. The rampaging Swedish infantry, with support of the cavalry, now advanced upon the first of the formed Imperial brigades. It was soon overcome and forced back, as was the second and the third. Just as it seemed as if the Imperial army was about to collapse entirely, its supreme commander, Wallenstein, appeared in the thick of battle to rally his men. His powerful presence and booming commands stopped their flight. Bringing up 3 regiments of cavalry, he managed to reform the shattered brigades and turn them to face the oncoming enemy. Wallenstein urged his men into hand-to-hand combat. Fierce man-to-man fighting now ensued. The combatants were too close to each other for firearms to be of any use now. Muskets were used as clubs and swords, and pikes were employed. Slowly but steadily, the Swedish advance was pushed back. After an hour of intense and bloody turmoil, the Imperials managed to recover lost ground, forcing the Swedes back beyond the trenches. This allowed the Imperials to regain the 7 cannons positioned there. At this stage of the battle, the advance of the Swedish centre had not gained a single inch of land, yet it had already lost more than 1,000 men. While this action was taking place, Gustavus was leading an attack on the Imperial left wing. The Finnish cuirassiers, who charged behind their king, overwhelmed the Croats and Poles on the other side. They were quickly routed and forced into a retreat. It was during this period, with his advance achieving overwhelming success, that Gustav received notice that his infantry had been pushed back and was retreating. On the far side, his right wing was also beginning to cave in under the pressure of the artillery fire coming from the windmills on the hill. Gustavus immediately resolved to personally right the situation. He handed over command of the left wing to General Horn, and then, taking with him a regiment, rushed towards the right flank in order to bolster it back up. The Swedish king's magnificent mount carried him across the battlefield at a rapid pace. However, his regiment soon lagged behind. Gustavus soon came upon his disorganized infantry, who were being hard pressed upon by the Imperials. He rushed forward to reconnoiter the situation and try to find a weak spot in the enemy's line that he could mount a counterattack against. As Gustavus moved along the melee, his men respectfully made way for him. This did not go unnoticed by the enemy. An imperial commander gave orders to a musketeer to fire upon that man, remarking that he must be a man of consequence. The musketeer took aim, and within seconds, the king's left arm was shattered and bleeding. Among his concerned men, the cry went up, "The king bleeds! The king is shot!" Gustavus tried to reassure his men by telling them that it was nothing and that they should continue to follow him. But the pain that he was experiencing was excruciating. Within minutes, he called the Duke of Lauenburg to his side. Speaking in French so that none of his men could hear, he told him to discreetly escort him out of the cauldron. In order to make the king's exit as unobserved as possible, Lauenburg took him on a circuitous route towards the right wing. Before they could get there, however, the king was shot a second time. This bullet struck him in the mid-back. As the life drained from his body, Gustavus whispered to Lauenburg, "Brother, I have enough. Look only to your own life." With that, he fell from his horse. There, his body was struck by several more enemy bullets. His horse, with its distinctive saddle covered in blood, now charged riderless through the battlefield. It gave the unmistakable message that the king was down. By the time his men reached his body, the enemy, in the form of Croats, had already got to it. A savage fight now took place over its possession. In the end, his corpse was left lying under a pile of bodies as the battle raged on. The death of the revered king rallied the Swedish army, and they fought on to defeat their foe. It was Gustavus's last posthumous victory. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe. If you have any other suggestions for future topics you'd like us to cover, please leave a comment below, and we'll see you next time on History Junkie.